So we know that there are studies that have been taken out of context and misrepresented. Let's talk about what real studies say about play and learning and brain development. Play builds brains. That's what we like to say because it's true. We are constantly building neural connections. And what some people say is that in one estimation, 40% of our neural connections that we have at birth are excess. We are built with a big plump brain that is not very efficient but has a lot of connections. In one estimation, as I said, 40% more than what we need, although there's some debate on the exact numbers for that. But we know that we have more than what we need. And so as a child is exposed to something, in the first 3 years especially, but even beyond then, they start strengthening the connections that they're exposed to and that they use, and pruning the ones that they don't need. That's why you'll hear the first 5 years or early head start or an emphasis on the beginning of life, because developmentally, from a science perspective, from brain development, it matters. I always use the example of the football player Michael Orr. If you've seen the movie The Blind Side, you'll be familiar. If you don't, he was a child who was in a very highly abusive situation as a young child. And he actually became homeless and was adopted by a family who was involved with a private school. They adopted him and he began playing football there. And when they tested him, his academic concepts, his literary concepts, his spatial reasoning skills for math were very, very low. But his protective reactions were off the chart. His fight or flight mechanisms were incredible, which made him a very good football player. Michael Orr was exposed to trauma and stress as a young child, so those were the connections that became strong for him. He was not exposed to reading and nursery rhymes and playing with an adult, and so those connections were not as strong for him. So if you think of that story, what you're exposed to matters, which is why play in relationship with an adult builds, and with other children, builds those connections that help for later in life. Dr. Hirsch, Pasek, and Golkinoff, they are the author of a book that I highly recommend called Einstein Never Used Flashcards. And they give some great suggestions on what real studies show. These are great things to remind parents as you're working with their young children. Studies show that despite what is represented in the media, there is no actual evidence that an educational program or a method are more effective for brain development than traditional play. There is not any sort of music that will make a child a genius or even have a higher IQ. Play should always be driven by the child's interest at the time and not by a product.